Rules Committee come to order, and thank you very much for joining us for another beautiful and fun day at the Rules Committee. Today the committee will be considering Senate Amendment to H-Con Res 71, a concurrent resolution establishing the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2018 and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2019 through 2027. On October 19th, the Senate approved their version of the fiscal year 2018 budget resolution by a vote of 51 to 49. While not perfect, concurrence by the House with the Senate amendments to H-Con Res 71 will pave the way for a reconciliation process to allow Congress to move forward on tax reform. That's why we're here today. The Senate passed budget echoes the House passed budget's focus on pro-growth policies of tax reform, regulatory reform, welfare reform, and health care reform. The Senate adopted an amendment to include most of the House passed budget enforcement provisions, which are designed to strengthen financial discipline. The American people, I believe, spoke strongly last November. So here we are today. I believe they are tired of brinkmanship and games in Washington. They want results. They want to pave forward ways for fundamental tax reform, and they want the kind of change and the results that I believe the American people have yearned for years. And I believe, at least in Dallas, Texas, my home, they are demanding it. Without objection, I'd like to welcome the chairwoman from Tennessee, the gentlewoman who will be leaving the United States Congress to run for the governor of Tennessee. And they're getting a genuine woman who is not only not afraid to tackle big things, but also equally gracious in the enunciation and support of that. Also, we welcome today Ranking Member Yarmouth. John, we're delighted that you're back. Your testimony last time was riveting, was of deserving of coming back again for the fun that we had, but most importantly, we appreciate you to represent not only your party, the district that you represent, but also the ideas and ideals that are very apparent here at the Rules Committee. And so, John, please know we're delighted to have you also. So, without objection, anything each of you have in writing, we'll enter that in the record. Before I move forward to recognize the gentleman, the ranking member, I want to recognize a very dear friend of mine, Jeff Miller, who is from Montgomery, Alabama. Mr. Miller is a dear and longtime friend. His son-in-law is my chief of staff, and his daughter is Martha Roby's chief of staff and was my communications director for a number of years, a young woman who went to Southern Methodist University. Jeff, welcome. We're delighted that you're here. Before we move forward with our witnesses, I'd like to move to the ranking member for any opening comments he would choose to make. The gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Well, thank you, and I'll be brief. I just want to welcome you both here. And you know, the chairman of the Rules Committee said that last November the people of this country spoke loudly. I mean, last time I checked, the person who got unfortunately, the person who's not in the White House is the person who got 3 million more votes. So I don't know how you define the American people speaking loudly, but I do not think that this budget represents what the people think of this country, in this country. I mean, this budget cuts, I think, everything that is important. It goes after Medicare and Medicaid. It goes after SNAP. It goes after the entire social safety net. And I think, and look, I'm a liberal, but I think it betrays conservative values. I mean, for years I've heard my Republican friends talk about the importance of controlling the deficit and the debt, and you got a budget here that allows the deficit to be increased by $1.5 trillion. I mean, it just seems, you know, so contrary to what my friends have been preaching for so many years, and so hypocritical. I don't get it. But anyway, budgets, you know, as have been said many times, represent our values. They're moral documents. They're what we believe in. And the budget that is before us today is something that I certainly don't believe in. My constituents don't believe in, and I believe the majority of people in this country don't believe in these priorities. And I think we're going to have a debate. We'll have a vote on this, but let's be honest. What this is a way to move forward or fast track a tax cut bill, mostly for wealthy people, that will add significantly to our deficit. And I think that is not good for our economy and certainly not good for this country. And I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Yes, sir, and thank you very much. Well, we're getting fired up for you both. As you can tell, this is an issue that brings delight to the eyes and ears and mouths of most members because, in fact, it is a basic philosophy. Today, we will be hearing a debate from the gentlewoman who will bring forth what I believe is an argument and that perhaps I, of all the people in the room, agree with the most, and perhaps, Mr. Yarmouth, you'll be bringing an issue that Mr. McGovern will agree with most, although I would probably express that probably Judge Hastings would be there too. But we will have our time together today, and both of you offer your professional evaluation, your representation of yourself and your own good name. And we are delighted that you're here to do that. So without objection, anything you have in writing will be in the record. The gentlewoman is going to push that button, and the gentlewoman with that, I almost called that burnt orange, but I know it's probably not to you, but it is to me. The gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I think that burnt orange is probably pretty close. I call it pumpkin, but I'm actually...
Burnt orange is UT, not University of Tennessee.
surprised that a guy knows about burnt orange and not just orange, so I'm impressed.
I'm for the burnt orange, darling. Yeah, it might be.
Wow.
Well,
Would you like to weigh in, Mr. McGovern?
He has an opinion. Yeah. Well, you know what? Diane, you've been here just a slight lesser time than Jim and myself, than the judge and myself, but I've been up here for 19 years with these gentlemen, and one thing we can count on is the genuine nature, and the debate is good, but theater is awesome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Slaughter, who is not here at this time, but if you will pass that on to her, that I did recognize her. Members of the committee, for having me testify as we continue to move forward with the budget for the fiscal year of 2018. I applaud lawmakers in the Senate for doing their part last week by passing a budget and bringing us one step closer to unlocking tax reform. And so today, I'm here to talk about the Senate-passed budget blueprint that is before us and why the passage in the House is so important. Without question, there are plenty of things I wish that were included in what the Senate passed, ideas that the House had put forward earlier this month when we approved our budget. For example, I still feel strongly about addressing unsustainable mandatory spending, and that hasn't changed. The growing burden of our debt caused by mandatory spending is a real problem that cannot be ignored. We owe it to the American people to do something, to offer serious reforms that ensure government programs are financially sustainable and work well for generations to come. And I think that we will tackle this important issue in the future. Actually, we really don't have a choice. But despite any of the shortcomings of the Senate-passed budget, I am encouraged that it does reflect the priorities of both chambers and has the support of the President. I also want to remind my colleagues that before final passage last week, the Senate included provisions previously passed by the House. So I was proud to be involved in the negotiations with the leaders in the House, the Senate, and the White House. So, for example, the Senate-passed budget creates a mechanism that will permit the Budget Committee chairman to adjust the budget allocations if there is a future legislation signed into law that revises the BCA spending caps. The Senate-passed budget also includes numerous improvements to the House budget enforcement that are designed to strengthen our fiscal discipline. At the end of the day, I support the Senate-passed budget because it makes history possible by unlocking tax reform for the first time in more than 3 decades. And this is something that we can all agree needs to be done for the American people to provide much needed middle-class relief from taxes and allow them to keep more of their hard-earned money in their pocket. I agree with President Trump that it should happen swiftly To achieve this essential goal, the House needs to pass the Senate budget this week so both chambers can get to work on tax reform as soon as possible. Thank you again for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Chairwoman, thank you very much. Much expectation about the discussion we're going to have. John, we're delighted you're here. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I very much appreciate your warm welcome. I will do my best to enthrall the committee once again. I have to say, though, it's pretty disheartening to see what this budget has become. This is not a real effort at responsible budgeting. It's a means to an end, a single-minded plan to make it far easier to enact tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations, regardless of the consequences for everyone else. If the budget before us today is advanced by this committee and then approved by the House, an irresponsible multi-trillion-dollar tax bill will come to the floor in a matter of weeks. It will be voted on under fast-track procedures that will allow it to move through Congress on a strictly partisan basis. It is important to point out that my Republican colleagues have tried to hide many of the details about this tax plan. It's clear to me that the Republican leadership is trying to rush this plan through before the American people can find out what's in it and then realize that it overwhelmingly benefits the wealthy and corporations while increasing taxes on millions of middle-class families. It should go without saying, but rushing through legislation that impacts nearly every American family and business is reckless, and voting on legislation that rewrites our nation's tax code a week or two after it is introduced without any real input from the people who will be impacted is negligent. But that is what you do when you can't defend your policies. And there's a lot of unjustifiable provisions in this budget. Like the House version, it showers tax cuts on the wealthy while making it harder for middle-class Americans to get by, let alone get ahead. It cuts vital national investments, threatening our economic progress and our national security, while willfully ignoring the needs and priorities of the American people. The budget cuts more than $4 trillion in mandatory spending, nearly $2 trillion from Medicare and Medicaid alone. It does nothing to alleviate the austerity-level spending limits for non-defense appropriations in 2018 and makes things far worse in the following years. The enormity of these cuts and the severity of the consequences for American families cannot be overstated. But more cuts will be coming once the Republican tax cuts blow an enormous hole in the federal budget. We will likely see a tax on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, nutrition assistance, on important benefits that help American families get ahead, and then more extreme cuts to key investments that keep our economy and our nation strong. I know my Republican colleagues desperately want to believe that the tax cuts in their budget will pay for themselves and usher in a new era of economic growth. Or at least they want the American people to believe that. But the record is clear. This approach has failed time and time again. We tried it in the early 1980s, the early 2000s under President George W. Bush, and we recently saw it play out to disastrous effect in Kansas. Now congressional Republicans want to try it again, even though experts from a wide array of backgrounds have concluded that these tax cuts will not create an economic boon, but will instead lead to a higher concentration of wealth among the rich while dramatically increasing deficits and debt. The Senate resolution gives fast-track protection for these tax cuts, but I am offering an amendment to eliminate that protection. My colleagues and I are also proposing several other amendments to address some of the most egregious provisions in this budget. My second amendment would make it the policy of this Congress to not create a giant new tax loophole for the wealthy owners of pass-through businesses. Creating this special lower rate will not make the tax code fairer, but it will give a $770 billion tax cut to millionaires and billionaires and create even more incentive for abuse as tax lawyers for the wealthy structure their clients' affairs to exploit this more lucrative loophole. And as I said on my floor speech when we debated the House resolution, we don't need to rely on experts on this. I know for a fact that this will save me 6 figures in income just through that pass-through provision alone. And I don't need that break. I am co-sponsoring amendments that would make it the policy of this Congress to not give tax cuts to the top 1%, to retain the estate tax, and to maintain the deduction of state and local taxes. And we are also offering additional amendments to reject some of the most disturbing cuts in the budget, those to health care and programs that help American families maintain a basic standard of living. Everything we do in the Budget Committee, in this committee, and in Congress as a whole should be about making the lives of American families better and more secure. We owe them a budget that invests in their future, a tax code that is fair, and a full and honest debate on both. This resolution is a failure on all fronts. I therefore urge my Republican colleagues to abandon this dangerous budget, or at least allow these important amendments that reflect the priorities of the American people, to be debated on the House floor. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesies, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your feedback. Chairwoman, the gentleman talked about placing the average American in a circumstance where their taxes were going to increase. Can you run through that, if you're prepared to, about probably what the average American pays today and what the average American could expect tomorrow?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, and as you know, we have put out a blueprint, although the final details will not be available until the passage of the budget. And that will, as I've said before, will be our golden key to doing tax reform at that point in time. Then the full package will be put out there, and there will be opportunity for the American people to take a look at that, as well as all the legislators here, and weigh in on the plan once it is put out. Look, the main objective of our Ways and Means Committee, and we've been working on having a fair, flatter, simpler tax code now for 7 years. It began under Chairman Camp, and as he says, the tax code is 70,000 pages, 10 times the size of the Bible, with no good news. Our objective and goal is to make sure that those in the middle and the lower income get relief. Relief both from the complexity that's in the code, as well as the amount of dollars that are taken out of their hard-earned pay. And so that is our goal, and I think once the plan is fully developed and people are able to see that, they'll see that's exactly what our goal is. And in the meantime, there's a lot of rhetoric, but we take those 7 brackets and we bring them down to 3, possibly 4. That decision hasn't been made. But look, those at the lower income are definitely going to get a break. Those who are at the 10% will go down to 0. We're doubling the standard deduction. We're increasing the child tax credit. We're maintaining the mortgage deduction. We're maintaining the deduction for charitable giving. And we're adding, and I think people will really appreciate this because our seniors are, of course, aging and a growing part of our population. We're even adding a deduction in there, just like for a child tax credit, where you'll have a credit for taking care of mom and dad. And so we're really, really looking at the hard-working taxpayer and saying, what can we do to give them relief? Too much money's coming out of their pocket. And frankly, when people keep more money in their pocket, or they have more money in their pocket, they tend to want to buy more goods and services. And when you do that, that means that somebody else has got to be hired to make that good or provide that service, which means that there will be more jobs available, the economy will grow, and we'll come out of the doldrums that we have been in for so many years of a growth less than 3%, which is the historic average, and we'll actually see a vibrant economy, and that's very exciting for every level, but more particularly, it is really the middle income earner that we are looking at that relief. Thank you for asking that question.
The House budget bill was one. This is the Senate budget bill. Can you talk with me, the statement that I made, because it's included in the bill, is about health care. I find that the average, many, if not average, American families take advantage of this pre-tax contribution of $5,000. And if there's one thing that shapes many discussions at town hall meetings that I have, it is this, that most families, especially if they have disabled children, reach that level of the pre-tax contribution in April or May as opposed to the whole year of $5,000. Can you discuss with me, if anything, that might be in either of those plans or your ideas about that, to raise that threshold?
Yes.
In competition with obviously understanding the whole package?
Yes. And that provision is being looked at. We've talked about it quite a bit in our meetings. Obviously, especially as you say, when people have children with disabilities that require more services than the average child, that we want to be sure that families have every opportunity that we can have to have them keep that money in their pocket to help take care of their children. So there haven't been released yet out to the public what we will be doing in that area, but it is one that I can tell you has had a lot of discussion and is recognized as an area that we have to make sure families are able to take care.
Well, I've been corresponding with Chairman Brady.
Yes.
Kevin Brady, and put this several times as a top, well, there's about 5 top issues, it seems like, but as a top way to help a broad number of people, families in this instance, sure it could be individuals, but families, as they approach these matters. And I want to thank you for your attention to that. Mr. Collins?
Thank you. We are looking forward to seeing this come through. It's been a long process. I appreciate it, Chairman. I appreciate the ranking member. And I do appreciate Mr. McGovern's real concern for us on things. So and I appreciate that. But we're looking forward to doing that.
Good, thank you very much. Mr. McGovern?
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Yarmouth, you know, listening to Sherwin Black talk about their tax proposal, Sherwin sounds like a Democrat. But I'm looking at an analysis here from that the Democrats in the Committee on Budget put out, talking about the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, their analysis of the Republican blueprint, which talks about a massive increase in debt, huge tax cut for the wealthy, not a middle-class tax cut, and many working families will see their taxes going up. Individuals are paying more, so big corporations and wealthy pass-throughs and richer states can pay less. I just want to give you an opportunity to kind of bring some balance to this issue.
Well, I thank you, Mr. McGovern, and pleasure to welcome the ranking member, Ms. Slaughter, my fellow native Kentuckian. You know, I would love to accept the notion that this plan is primarily aimed at lower and middle income Americans. But when you propose eliminating the estate tax, which only affects people with couples with estates more than $11 million and individuals with more than $5 million, when you eliminate the alternative minimum tax, which only affects high income earners, when you permit the pass-through at a much lower rate of corporate business earnings, that disproportionately affects very, very wealthy Americans who have the opportunity to take advantage of that. And when you decrease the highest rate from 39.6% to 35%, which has, in dollar terms, a much, much greater impact for a benefit for the wealthiest Americans than lowering the rate for somebody in the lower half of the income scale, it's hard to conclude that the primary objective of this plan is to help lower and moderate income Americans. I would feel much more comfortable about it if all of those, if these analyses did not show that at the end of 10 years, 80% of the benefits of this proposal would go to the top 1% of Americans. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say this is for moderate and lower income Americans. And granted that the details have not been released yet, but that to me reinforces the point that I think is most critical to make here, and that is that we are proposing here to pass an enormous change for the American public that impacts everyone from the lowest income American to the highest, and every business. And we're going to do it in a matter of weeks with virtually no public hearings and on a fast-track procedure. That, to me, is almost an insult to the American people.
Well, that's, as you know, what the Republicans did with the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act. They didn't want it out there very long. They didn't want a deliberative process. They didn't want people to see it. It was written in a back room somewhere, you know, and thankfully, you know, the bad process which produced a bad result, you know, didn't become law. Ms. Black, I think the last time you guys were here was on October 3rd. In your testimony, I'm quoting from your testimony, you said, our budget, this was the House budget at the time, our budget acknowledges that achieving balance is a challenge, but it proves it is not an impossible task. That's what you said in this room. And I guess my question to you is, since the budget you bring us today blows a hole in the deficit at the tune of at least 1.5 trillion, are you now saying a balanced budget is impossible?
No, sir, I'm not. And I know that sometimes it's a little difficult, not necessarily to you, because you've been around and you certainly do understand that the rules in the House are different than the rules in the Senate. And so their $1.5 trillion tax cut, with their rules, they do not permit the use of the current policy baseline. And so we see that it's a little difficult to be able to show the balance because they use a different baseline. And secondary to that, unlike what we can do here in the House, is we can use macroeconomics to show that there will be growth to fill that hole of that $1.5 trillion of cuts. So they do have a different number now. I would like to have our budget. Let's just, you know, I would be disingenuous to say that I wish that we didn't have our budget. But there is a difference in the way in which they score things and the way that they use the policy over there to come up with their policies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, and I don't want to defend the Senate, but I think that they're probably using math and not funny math. And I think there are too many people in this chamber that use funny math. You know, you may have been maybe acquainted with the article that referenced Bruce Bartlett, who was the domestic policy advisor for Ronald Reagan. And he recently published an article in the Washington Post entitled, "I Helped Create the GOP Tax Myth. Trump is wrong, tax cuts don't equal growth." I ask unanimous consent to insert that in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Objection will include.
But reviewing past tax policy, Mr. Bartlett states, and I quote, I'm not sure how many Republicans even know anymore that Reagan raised taxes several times after 1981. His last budget showed that as of 1988, the aggregate cumulative revenue loss from the 1981 tax cut was $264 billion, and legislated tax increases brought about half of that back. He further notes that although Republicans today cite the Tax Reform Act of 1986 as a model tax legislation, I quote, strenuous efforts by economists to find any growth effect from the 1986 Act have failed to find much. The most thorough analysis found only a shifting of income due to tax reform, no growth effects. I guess, end quote. I guess my only point is that, you know, I think to come here or for my friends to make the argument that this is about balancing the budget and not about, you know, exploding a hole in the deficit, I think that's just hard to fathom. I mean, the facts are overwhelming to prove that the opposite is true, and I, you know, I just wanted to point that out because you seem very focused on, you know, the importance of balancing the budget, controlling our deficits and our debt, and now what we have here is something that doesn't reflect those values. So, in any event, we'll have an opportunity to. Would you like to add anything, Mr. Yarmouth?
No, I just want to make one point. The cuts under this bill actually are significantly more than 1.5 trillion. In total, the tax cuts are about $5 trillion.
Right.
The net impact on the deficit, or the debt, after 10 years is 1.5 trillion reduction. But the tax cuts are much more consequential than that. And if you accept that figure that after 10 years, 80% of the tax cuts will go to the top 1%, you're talking about in the neighborhood of over a 10-year period, $4 trillion to the top 1%.
You know, and as we add to the debt, we have what we call the debt tax. I mean, we have to pay. I mean, none of this just disappears. And so, I mean, that's another aspect of this that we ought to pay attention to. But, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the debate on the floor, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Slaughter, would you like to go right now?
If you don't
Joe, I'm
mind.
sorry to ask.
Let
Well,
me do
we'll
that.
give you your own time.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'm going to be pretty succinct here because I did hear your statement. You mentioned Brownback in Kansas. If past is prologue, it doesn't mean a damn thing here, does it? Because we are duplicating Kansas, which is in terrible shape. And we have to watch trickle down not work a third time because they've got the votes to do it. And it's all there is to it. It's a shame. But I do think, at least for my district, being home a week, they understand it, what's going on up there. They know that tax cuts aren't coming to them. And that once more, they're going to be giving up things. The issue about the 401K, just became apparent a few days ago. And it's, there's a world of hurt in this. But I object strenuously what they're doing to Medicaid and Medicare. And but so that's about it. I don't have any questions to ask about it. What is. Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth, and both of you for your hard work.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
That was a nice conclusion. The klutz of America strikes again.
Louise, did you know that last week I threw the winning touchdown pass at the members' Capitol Hill Police football game? But they won 7-0.
Very good. I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
That's bothered me all day.
So,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I couldn't find, I dropped the fumble here too.
Okay,
That means I threw the interception.
I see.
Yeah.
All right.
They scored the touchdown, so I dropped the glasses
Well, you
too.
did
I'm
just
sorry.
fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I should have held on to it.
We're trying our best. The gentleman from the Budget Committee and the Rules Committee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't be as succinct as Ms. Slaughter was, only because I've worked with these two folks all year long, and I've seen the amount of effort that has gone in to this. To my chairwoman, I just have to say, we talk a lot about perseverance up here. I don't think most of us understand what perseverance means until we've stood in the shoes that you have stood in, as you have never taken no for an answer. I understand the criticisms that some members on this panel are making of that work product. I also understand the criticism that was present in every single meeting that we had from someone on the political continuum. If we wouldn't need a chairman and a ranking member, if we could all agree on everything to begin with, for Pete's sakes, if we have more than two members in a room, we have a disagreement about where it is we ought to go and how it is we ought to get there. I have been on the Budget Committee for 7 years, and I have never seen a chairman navigate those disagreements the way that you have. I hope that was apparent from the ranking member's perspective as well. The big things that we do start on the Budget Committee. The outlines that we lay out begin in the spring on the Budget Committee. And the tone we set for how we deal with one another, I would tell you, in many cases, begins there on the Budget Committee. I just want to thank you for that leadership. You came in an extraordinarily difficult circumstance with the gentleman from my home state, the former chairman of the Budget Committee, being called into service in the administration, and you're being willing to pick up that mantle of leadership with virtually no notice, and with your job being the very first job that had to get done coming out of the gate. I don't know that because we all tend to focus on today's news cycle, or maybe if we're have particularly long memories yesterday's news cycle, folks don't remember that you were called in an extraordinarily difficult time to do an extraordinarily difficult job, and one that will come to conclusion on the floor of the House this week. So I want to thank you for that. And to my ranking member, I want to thank you as well. We talk so much about partisanship, particularly on this panel, but a little bit on the Budget Committee panel too. It actually gives me great hope about the things that we can do together going forward. You don't have to get 50 votes on a reconciliation bill. You can get 60 votes or 70 votes, or in some cases 80 votes on a reconciliation package. I'm not giving up hope that we can do that. Our differences tend to show up in bright, vivid colors on the Budget Committee. Sometimes our common ground does not show up in those same vivid colors. And I regret that because I think folks would have more the sense of hope that I have if they could see what some of those opportunities might be. But I'm glad we're here for a budget conference week. I'm not collecting any money from those folks who bet against us. I didn't take their money because I didn't think it'd be fair to take it. But folks have been betting against us and our committee all year long. And if they weren't betting against us, they were betting against our ability to cooperate with the United States Senate. And the fact that you are sitting here today, Madam Chair, reminds me that it doesn't matter how dark those days are, if people refuse to take no for an answer, as you did, from folks in all sections of this great body, we can really do extraordinary things. And I thank you for doing that and stepping up to lead in that circumstance. With that, Mr. Chairman, I am thrilled to be handling budget issues for this committee and hope that you will view favorably my ability to handle this tomorrow, because I'd be thrilled to go to the House floor and sell this work product. We've invested not hours, not days, not weeks, but months in this work product, and I would be proud to represent it if you so decide. I yield back.
But we got to pass it first. Got to pass the bill to see what's in it. John, sorry, it's Diane Black Day at the Rules Committee, so you're just going to have to put up with this stuff.
It's quite, I'm one of her biggest fans. She's a joy to work with.
Yeah, Rob, in fact, does spend time chairwoman and member, as you know, and Rob is most attuned to the needs of this. And
If I may respond to one thing
Yes, sir.
Mr. Woodall said, and he's so right. I mean, he and I have had conversations off camera, and that's an important distinction, about a number of issues, and have gotten very close to a meeting of the minds on some of them. And so I know what's possible if I think the outside world didn't make it very difficult to work with the other side. And that's something we need to work on.
Yes, sir. Well, I've spent a couple of years on the Budget Committee, too, and will tell you it's an amazing exercise, and I appreciate it very much, your service on behalf of this committee also, Rob. The gentleman from Florida, Judge Hastings.
Thank you very much,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, and I thank Chairwoman Black and Ranking Member Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth, you said that the chair lady is a delight to work with. I believe that's the case, but how much working with her has been done in the production of the product that we have here?
Well, yes, I have to concede that we were not consulted in the construction of the budget that came before the committee.
All right, and if we look at the overall way that these tax bills come to us, arguably, a whole lot is going on in back rooms now. Would you agree, with no Democrats in the room?
I totally agree, and that's one of the points that I tried to make in my opening statement, that when you propose to enact legislation of this consequence, the numbers that are involved, the magnitude of the impact on the economy, the impact on every citizen and every business and corporation, and to do it in such a swift manner, a closed manner, a secretive manner, then you're depriving the American people of the opportunity to consider the impact and whether this is an advisable piece of legislation or not, whether their lives are going to be helped or hurt. I would venture to say that if this procedure goes on as scheduled, then there aren't 2% of the American people who will have any idea how this impacts their lives until they have to fill out their tax returns the first time after it's implemented. And that's dangerous. It's not only negligent, it's dangerous.
When the matter was debated on the floor previously, and you made your presentation, you may not have a memory, but shortly afterward, when I saw you, I complimented you for personalizing the situation. Tell us how the pass-through affects you and people in your category.
Well, right now, my primary source of income is my investment in a family business. It's a restaurant business. We've done very well with it. It's a subchapter S
I'm
corporation.
told it's good barbecue.
It's great barbecue, thank you very much. It's in many of your states, Mr. Woodall, and yes, in yours, Mr. Hastings. Not in yours, Mr. McGovern. But but we're working that way. Anyway, we're a subchapter S corporation, so all of the income earned in that corporation already is passed through. It is taxed at individual rates. Right now, my co-shareholders and I, and it's basically the 4 siblings in my family, pay a 39.6% tax on the revenue, the income from that business. If this proposal goes through as outlined, we will pay 20% rather than 39.6%. It's basically a 50% cut in my tax liability based on this proposal. And there's no justification for that because we're not going to invest that money back in the business. I'm a passive investor. I'm a congressman. I don't have anything to spend it on. What am I going to do? I'm going to put it in the bank, I guess. But when you consider the impact of doing it and the cuts that it's going to mean for many Americans as a result of this, who aren't nearly as lucky as I am, then there's no way as a human being and as somebody who's entrusted with the welfare of everybody in my district that I could, in good conscience, say this is good policy. Yeah. And, I'm not alone. And again, if the estimates are right and 80% of the tax breaks in this budget by 2027 go to the top 1%, this is a policy that is truly misguided.
The 1986 tax reform, none of us in here, I don't think, Ms. Slaughter, you weren't here in 86, were you? Were? So then you would know that it took 11 months in order for this measure to be brought to the floor. I don't think any of us in here are not in favor of meaningful tax reform. Of course I will.
Because that was totally bipartisan, if you recall, too. Because the whole Ways and Means Committee was
Right.
as well as the
I
budget.
trust your judgment because I was not here until 1992. And, but in reading about it, I learned that it took 11 months for it to be done. Chairwoman Black, last week, you tweeted that what part of cut spending does at Senate GOP not understand? And then at House GOP showed how with conservative #balanced budget, time for the Senate to act. How can you call out the Senate 1 week for not having a balanced budget and then come before us today to support a budget that will do everything you ridicule them for and increasing the deficit by $1.5 trillion?
Thank you, Mr. Hastings. And I think at the beginning you heard me say in my opening remarks that I'm not happy with not having mandatory reforms in the budget. I'm not happy about that at all, and I've made that very clear everywhere I've been because I do believe that unless we admit that we're spending more than what we bring in every single year, and frankly, I came to Congress 7 years ago with this same thought and this same mantra, that we have to worry about how much we spend. I will say that even as we were talking and the ranking member, Ms. Slaughter, talked about Governor Brownback and Kansas, that it's a much different plan of what he did than what we are doing. But you have to look at your spending in relationship to your cuts that you might be doing in the tax reform. And I don't at all propose that we could even do tax reform right now and not still watch our spending, and that we're not going to be in a bad shape, because it's both ways. And that happened even during the time of Reagan. Art Laffer, who is the creator of Laffer Curve, has written several articles because he was there when Reagan did his tax reform. And it did stimulate the economy to a point where the economy was doing very, very well. But also what happened on the other side of that was that there was an increase in spending, which then caused the necessity to raise more taxes because the spending was coming in. So there is a balance. Now, the reason why at this point in time I'm going to support the measure that we have here is this is an opportunity for us, the first time in a generation, to actually do real comprehensive tax reform. And the American people are wanting to have a fairer, flatter, simpler system, and I think the time is here, and so I will forego that in hopes that in the next budget, and I'm being told by my leadership that they will, on the next budget, be looking at those mandatory reforms, because frankly, you can stimulate the economy and have the economy grow after this tax reform, and if you're going to continue to spend more than what you bring in, you're going to still be in that same situation.
All right, Ms. Black, can you honestly say that you disagree with the tax experts across the political spectrum, including Mr. McGovern introduced Mr. Bartlett's statement, and Steve Moore and several others that I've read or heard, and there are other economists. But can you honestly say that you disagree with them that tax cuts will not pay for themselves?
Well, tax cuts alone do not stimulate the economy. As I say, there's also a balance with the amount that you bring in, that you have to balance both sides of that. So it is again not one-sided, as nothing in life is one-sided. You say if you just do one thing, then it's going to be the same results on the other side. You've got to look at both the spending and also the cuts at the same time.
All right. Now, you and I were alive during the period of time in the 80s when President Reagan, you just cited, did his tax cuts, and ultimately, according to you, required to do increases because of increased spending. The rhetoric, and you addressed the rhetoric in your opening remarks. The rhetoric has been usually talking about trickle down. Is this a trickle down type budget that we see?
What I will tell you that our goal is, and I believe we are reaching that goal in our tax reform, is that we are looking at the middle and lower income families, and to be able to give them an opportunity to keep more in their pocket.
If I could reclaim my time for just about,
Certainly.
how much will a family that has $12,000 of income receive from this particular
A
measure?
family at $12,000 would not pay anything.
Okay, then let me go to the top group
Okay.
and bring in 500 Fortune 500 people. Do you believe that reducing the corporate tax rate, the statutory corporate tax rate, is going to cause those corporations to pay the full amount? And a follow-on to that is, do you have an idea as to how many of the top corporations in this country pay the full statutory rate of 35%?
I could not tell you how many, what percentage. I don't have those numbers.
Let me share with you a little bit of the numbers. 100 of them paid nothing. Nothing. Just think about that. 100 of the top corporations in this country paid zero taxes. 18 of them paid a rate at 12.1%. And maybe, Mr. Yarmouth, you can help me understand something that I've been having a lot of difficulty and wrestle with, and that is the constant mantra that I hear from our friends, the Republicans, and the president, that America's corporations pay the highest tax rate. That's the way they leave it. They don't say the statutory tax rate. They just say American corporations pay the highest tax rate. Give me a little bit back on that.
Well, I mean, you've actually answered your own question previously. If you take the 35 countries in the OECD, the most industrialized nations on earth, the United States does have the highest statutory tax rate, which is 35%. The average of the OECD countries is about 22 or 23%. But as you stated, very few American corporations, because of deductions and loopholes and the ability in some cases with international corporations to keep income earned overseas outside the country and beyond American taxation, pay far less. And there was one study done recently of 92 Fortune 500 companies that paid 20% or less effective tax rate. And what they did, and in fact, those companies over a 5-year period had actually laid off 300,000 people and had increased salaries for their CEOs and other high-ranking officers. So the idea that lowering tax rates is going to somehow accrue to the benefit of workers or to the economy generally is not borne out by what actually happens in the real world. In fact, the money goes to those people running those corporations. It goes to shareholders in the form of higher dividends, but it does not help create jobs or stimulate economic growth. And I'm not an economist, but I've talked to some who say the whole idea of trickle-down only works when there is high demand for goods and services and very low access to capital. That's when trickle-down can work in theory. The fact is that in today's world, there is an abundance of capital and there is not an abundance of demand. Absolutely. So just on economic theory alone, cutting the taxes on these corporations and upper-income individuals is not likely to have any significant positive impact.
And in this proposal, do some middle-class families see a tax increase?
There's one analysis, and I can't attribute it right now, but there's one analysis that 45% of middle-income families, those are people making from $50,000 to $150,000, would actually pay more in income tax. Now, again, to be fair, the details of the plan have not been written. We don't know when these new tax brackets, what the levels of income would be with them, so forth. But you have a pretty good overall idea of where, because you're not talking about huge changes in the rates. So you have a ballpark figure. And again, one analysis was 45%, or another one was 47 million people. 47 million people would have their taxes increased in the middle income categories.
Let me ask unanimous consent to include in the record September 29, 17 Tax Policy Center analysis of the framework that we're
Without
talking
objection,
about.
that'll be in the record.
Now, Ms. Black, according to this Tax Policy Center, those with the highest incomes would receive the biggest tax cuts. And many middle-class families would even experience, as I just asked Mr. Yarmouth, tax increases on average. How is this tax framework even remotely fair to average Americans? And how can you tell me and others that this is meant to help them?
Mr. Hastings, I'll be really proud when we do finally get all of our information out and show you on a calculator how we are helping those at the middle and the lower income. As has been said by my colleague, all of the information on the brackets has not been put out there yet because, as you all know, this is a very complicated exercise because when you change one thing, you have to dial something on the other side. So you don't have all of the information out, and it's not ready at this point in time. But I will tell you with all sincerity that that is exactly what we want to do, is to make sure that the middle income and the lower income are getting a relief on their taxes and also a simplification. And so I don't know
I
what
hear you.
numbers are being used in that document. I'd have to study it in order to be able to respond to that.
My concern is that it's being done without the expertise of extraordinary individuals in the Democratic Party, and there's no reason on the Senate or the House side, or staffers or anybody else, for everybody not to be pitching in to try to figure out what can we do for middle-income families especially, and for low-income families that may be hurt by some of the cuts that are being proposed. I hear you with reference to mandatory measures, but we've known it all these years as Social Security is the third rail. Trust me when I tell you that rail is still there and bigger with the number of people that are entering into Social Security every day. But Mr. Yarmouth and Ms. Black, when all of the facts are known, when you've done your one-sided tax measure that ostensibly is going to get to the president's desk, will that measure, as you understand it, since you are in the rooms or sometimes, will it increase the deficit by 2027?
That depends upon the assumptions that you use. And as I say, the Senate uses different assumptions than what the House does. We do macroeconomic and according to the macroeconomic, and we use actually very conservative numbers of 2.6% GDP growth over that 10-year period. There are some studies that say that it will be as much as 3.5%. But when you use those macroeconomics, and I do believe, considering what we saw during the 1986 tax reform, and they saw that extraordinary growth up to 7%, that the assumptions that we're making are very, very conservative.
I hear you. And my overall sentiment is this. Republicans cut taxes, and then Democrats come and increase taxes because the need never changes. So that's why trickle-down has never worked and isn't going to work, but we're in an environment now where there's absolutely too much pain because we've kicked the can down the road on discharging many of our responsibilities that should have been undertaken. And then we have things like off-budget wars that are going on, disasters even today that we can't fund adequate all over this country. And that becomes a genuine concern to many of us. I believe that my friends here on this committee are genuine conservatives, genuinely believe that it would be helpful to the economy if this kind of budget passed. But all of them, and you, Ms. Black, and countless of my friends have argued over the years against deficits when Clinton was president and against deficits when Obama was president, and yet you're getting ready to come here with something that's likely to create as much as $5 trillion and certainly going to create immense problems. Now you see us walking back on the many things that may produce revenue that's going to be needed, and you got that $1.5 trillion hole that you can't fill because the interest groups continue to come in, and then every time somebody comes up with something else, it backs off a significant number of people. As I understand it, 80% of the tax cut goes to the top 1%. The average tax cut for the top 1% will be $207,000 a year. The average tax cut for millionaires will be $230,000 a year. By the way, back to that little bitty group at the bottom, $60. $60. I remember we had a tax cut one time, and we got $200 that was supposed to help the middle class. I bought liquor with my $200. But the average
I hope
tax
it was
cut.
bourbon.
Yeah, some of it was bourbon, John. No, the average tax cut for the top 1/10 of 1% is $1 million a year in 27. 1/4 of all households face a tax increase, and Mr. Yama pointed out that's over 42 million households. 45% of all households with children will see a tax increase. And among households earning between $50,000 and $150,000, nearly a third will see a tax increase. In total, individuals will see their taxes go up by $471 billion, so that corporations, pass-throughs, and estates can get a tax cut totaling $2.9 trillion. It does not make sense with the pain that I see. Mr. McGovern has been a champion, for example, on SNAP. Last week, in the congressional district that I served, at 1 o'clock in the morning, I went to a line that had in it nearly 2,000 people waiting for food stamps as a result of what just transpired in Florida with reference to the hurricane. That was the third day. They were waiting in line, some of them 13 hours, in order to be able to get the food stamps. And these were black, white, Latino, old and young people in rich Palm Beach County. Something is drastically wrong if we continue to hammer the middle class and hurt the lower class and help the upper class get more money. You're building Frankenstein monsters with budgets, and that is a tragic mistake that many of you will see in your lifetime. We should be about the business of trying to help all of the people in this country, not give billionaires tax or relief. They don't need it. Corporations that don't pay no taxes don't need it either. And I could go on and on. Maybe I'll join Mr. McGovern or Ms. Slaughter to argue against my good friend, Mr. Woodall, when he's on the floor tomorrow. I yield.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Black, I'm going to read to you a quote from a president of the United States. I'm going to ask you which president said these things. But the most direct and significant kind of federal action aiding economic growth is to make possible an increase in private consumption and investment demand, to cut the fetters which would hold back private spending. The final and best means of strengthening demand among consumers and business is to reduce the burden on private income and the deterrents to private initiative which are imposed by our present tax system. And this administration pledged last summer to an across-the-board, top-to-bottom cut in personal and corporate income taxes. He goes on to say, make sure I get this right, the present tax system reduces financial incentives for personal effort, investment, and risk-taking. In short, to increase demand and lift the economy, the federal government's most useful role is not to rush into a program of excessive increases in public expenditures, but to expand the incentives and opportunities for private expenditures. Who do you think said that?
I'm not certain, but I'm going to guess JFK.
It was. It was President John F. Kennedy.
He did not give me
in
any hint,
1962.
I promise.
And unfortunately, as you know, he was tragically killed in November of 1963 before Congress could enact that tax cut. It actually was enacted in 1964 under President Johnson. Now, I wanted to know what happened as a result of that, so I looked it up. And by the way, their tax cuts were income tax cuts, including cuts to the very top bracket, and corporate tax cuts, both. So what happened? Unemployment fell from 5.2% in 1964 to 4.5% in 1965 and 3.8% in 1966. Now, people estimated that there would be a loss of revenue from these tax cuts. Do you know what happened the next 2 years? Tax revenue went up. It went up both in 1964 and 1965. Now, I know you remember a little better, as we all do, what happened in the 1980s. We had the Reagan tax cuts. And remember, they were passed in 81, but they phased in over a few years. Let me just read to you the figures of what happened to gross domestic product in the United States starting in 1983. GDP increased in 1983 by 7.83%, in 1984 by 5.63%, in 1985 by 4.28%, In 86, a disappointing year, only 2.94%. In 87, 4.5%. In 88, 3.84%. Does that come, are those numbers even close to the low numbers we've seen the last several years?
No way.
Well, let's talk about the numbers the last few years. Remember, we had all the taxes passed under President Obama that totaled about $1.6 trillion. And to be fair to him, you can't start with the year they were passed, 2010. Let's go to 2011. GDP rose 1.68%. 2012, it rose 1.28%. In 2013, it rose 2.66%. In 2014, it rose 2.7%. In 2015, it rose 2.02%. And in 2016, last year, it rose only 1.84%. Now, I look at those numbers, tax cuts, growth, tax cuts, growth, tax increases, anemic GDP, and I come to the conclusion that contrary to what we've heard before, tax cuts do in fact increase demand, they increase consumption, and they increase the well-being of the American people, as we saw with what happened after President Kennedy enacted, or the Kennedy tax cuts were enacted under President Johnson. Is that the reason why you are so strongly supportive of tax cuts, because they in fact get the economy going again and help the average American people?
I think you said it very well, and history will show us that. And once again, I'm going to say this, that when you look back at the tax cuts and the economy that is stimulated, and frankly, I always tell people that if they would have just sent the stimulus money to all of us women, we would have bought shoes and clothes and all those wonderful things that women like to do when they shop, and you really would have stimulated the economy, because we all know if people have more money, more disposable income, they will purchase goods and services. And when they do, that means somebody's got to make those goods and somebody's got to provide those services, which gives somebody else a job and an increase in income. So to me, it's very simple. I'm not an economist, but we have seen by history that when you give people an opportunity to have more money, they do have expendable income, which allows them to do the things they want to do with their money rather than what the government wants them to do.
Well, you know, I think John Adams was the person that said facts are stubborn things. So I want to get those facts out there because they are stubborn things. Mr. Yarmouth is correct. We don't know exactly what's going to be in the text of this bill, and there's been a lot of speculation about it. Some of it this week, and quite frankly, some of it just irresponsibly wrong. But I guess that's the way things are done up here. We're going to get a bill probably next week. If we can pass this budget this week, I think we will get a bill next week. But it's going to be a bill built on principles that we have been talking about on the Republican side in the House since at least September of last year, if I'm not right, when the Better Way program was rolled out. And it's been refined even more. I believe you're on the committee. Y'all have been refining it in the committee over the course of months and months now. I guess almost 10 months now. Isn't it time for us to do what we said in September of last year and pass tax reform for the good of the American people?
Well, Mr. Byrne, I think it's also instructive to know that I came here in 2011 and was on the Ways and Means Committee from the very beginning. And we have been looking at tax reform. You'll remember that under Chairman Camp, we put out a working draft that folks were able to see. And I will tell you, we had a lot of great feedback. We've listened to the people about that, industries, individuals. And so it's not just even been just this short period of time. And Mr. McGovern, I do want to let you know that under Chairman Camp, we had working groups. As a matter of fact, Danny Davis was my working co-partner on education, tax credits, and so we have worked across the aisle. We had 11 working groups, and it's not as though this was something that just popped up yesterday. This is a seed that was planted some 7 years ago now, and we're finally to the point where we believe that we have done the good work and we have a plan and policies that are going to grow this country.
Well, I appreciate the hard work you and everybody on both sides of the aisle in the Budget Committee have done. I know it's hard work. I wish we still had the House budget before us, but we don't. And I'm learning up here sometimes you have to give and take to get things done. But it seems to me that the American people want us to get things done. And we've spent all this time talking about it. Now we're going to get a bill, and I think the American people expect us to act. Now, we do all need to read the bill. I know we've passed some bills, important pieces of legislation in Congress before that people didn't read the legislation.
Healthcare.
But we're going to have plenty of time to read the bill and understand it based upon principles we've been talking about for a very long time. And then we're going to have the time when we vote. Now, we all vote as we believe is best for our constituents. And I don't question other people in this House for how they vote if they think they're voting for their constituents. We all have to make that decision. But if this bill is based on the principles I've heard for the last year or so, then it looks like it's going to be good for my constituents. And I think I would not be doing my job if I didn't vote for a bill that was good for my constituents. So thank you for your work, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the gentleman referenced with, great respect, President Kennedy. He may be nostalgic for those days, but I wonder if he's nostalgic for the tax rates, tax brackets of those days. I don't know whether he knows what the top marginal rate was in 1962. It was 91%.
It was.
So maybe that might be what the gentleman would like to.
It just goes to prove that less is more.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I would just.
Lower tax rates is more for the
Well,
American people.
I think we need to.
That's good.
We need to put our history in perspective. The other thing I would say is that I appreciate the gentlelady talking about all the time we have talked about the need for tax reform. But talking about tax reform and saying tax reform is different than having a document in front of us that we can go through and measure the impact. I mean, this is the same problem with your repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. We never saw it, and it was not analyzed, and when it was finally analyzed, it was a disaster. So sometimes it makes sense to take it a little slowly and for us all to do our due diligence. I thank the chairman for yielding.
Yes, sir. Was there a response?
Just very briefly.
Gentlemen, we're going to allow that.
Okay.
We're going to have text next Wednesday, November the 1st. We all know what's coming. We all know the principles it's going to be based on. We've got staff. Use your time, use your staff, do what I think our constituents have sent us here for. We all need to do our own homework. You may read it and say, I don't think it's good for my constituents. That's your judgment. I'm not going to question your judgment if it's based on what's good for your constituents. But I believe that I have plenty of information and that I'll have plenty of time to read the text and know what I'm voting on. And if I think it's good for my constituents, I'm going to vote for it. If I don't, I'm not. And I know you're going to do the same thing.
Absolutely, and I'm not going to vote for it.
But I do believe that lowering tax rates has been proven historically by President Kennedy and by President Reagan to be good for the economy, and raising taxes under President Obama proved to be bad for the economy.
You need to read the article from Mr. Bartlett. It was Reagan's
I did read that article, as a matter of fact, and I think he's dead wrong. And I'll go with President Kennedy, and I'll go with President Reagan, and I'll go back to those GDP increases, those anemic GDP increases, under the incredible tax increases under President Obama, and I'll take tax cuts under tax increases any day. And I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, could I have a
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentlewoman from New York.
I just want to point out that I do remember the good old days, I'm sure you do too, that when we
Last
came
year.
to the Rules Committee, we had text to work on. It wasn't supposition, and we'll see something next week, but
I think we will.
this is the,
Well, this is, in my opinion, what we're working on. Is that correct?
what is that?
This is a piece of legislation, isn't it? There it is right there. Well, I don't know, it may not be in your packet, but I'll give you mine. Yes, ma'am, I apologize. That's what we're going to be debating and voting on. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You know what? I apologize. If I'm the only one
When they
with
finish the back rooms, it's gonna be 1,000 or more pages, and very few people are going to
But
read
you know
it.
what, Judge?
Staffers will read
Excuse
it,
me.
and there'll be crap in it that nobody will know about until way on down the line.
Judge, just let me help you. And so, excuse me, just give me just a moment, please.
Yes, sir.
With the clerk, please do me a favor and go make a determination if all the members of the committee have the package of the amendment in front of them. That's all I do. Thank you. I'm sorry, Judge, I did not know if there was a viewpoint that you did not have it, and that would not be fair.
I think,
This, this is not the document that we're going to see, Mr. Chairman. I'll await for the real crap.
Oh, you're talking about what's next week. I'm talking about what we're debating now.
Whole week, I'll sit down with
Okay, well, that will, well, I don't know that. I think we're gonna, probably put it up on the website pretty quickly.
Well, that's good, which proves again that you're in a rush and ignoring history when it comes to these kind of complexities. I do not buy into the fact that we talk about everything. I didn't buy Bradley's argument just a minute ago because he didn't take into consideration the ups and downs, the vagaries of an economy are very difficult, and you can use assumptions that will get you where you need to be, but that ain't the way the world works. And I'm out here in the working world, as are you, and we ought to be about the business of trying to work together to get something done for the people of this country.
You know what, Judge, I will be the first to tell you, there's a lot to that. But what I will also tell you is that our friends that are Democrats chose to go their direction with President Obama, and they did. And they did.
Chairman,
And we chose to go this way. And that's just a fact.
I find it incredible that I'm hearing no later than about 15 minutes before we came in here, the gentleman on the other side in the majority, or the leader, and his associates that were on television, talking about us as obstructionists. Man, I can't be an obstructionist or something when I'm not in the room. When I'm in the room, I'm an obstructionist, and you all can't tell me. That's why I find it passing strange that all of the obstruction that took place during the Obama administration is supposed to be ignored all of a sudden, and now Louise and Jim, myself, John, all of us that are Democrats are obstructionists. I'm not an obstructionist. I'm here appealing for us to work together to do something. And I can do that. I adore some of y'all. Some of y'all I don't like. But the simple fact of the matter is that I can work with those that I adore. And I'll work with those that I don't like if it's toward a constructive end that will help the most vulnerable people in our society and will leave the best off in our society in a way that I believe they want to be, and that's to help people too. But thank you, Chairman. Now, why don't you ask Ms. Cheney?
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think, sometimes we talk past one another, but I think the frustration with this budget document is it just has some aggregate figures, and I think we all are wondering, when you get down to the line items of the agencies and how much everything gets, if we have an indication how long we'll have to examine that document before we have to vote on it.
Well, that's a good question for the
I'll ask the
gentleman.
chair.
I will have to get you that information because I don't know that.
Okay.
Yeah, this-
I would just indicate again as a recommendation, obviously, something as incredibly complicated and comprehensive as the budget, the longer the better, meaning, a week or two as opposed to a day or two would be much appreciated. Mr. Yarmouth, how much by third-party analysis or objective analysis would this budget increase the deficit by over 10 years?
Actually, according to the Senate Republicans, it would increase the deficit by $1.5 trillion.
And I think, my concern is a lot has been said about, lowering taxes, raising taxes. Obviously, we all want to lower taxes. But the issue is when you increase a deficit like that, isn't it many ways forcing a future generation to pay taxes?
I don't think there's any question about that. And Mr. Byrne referenced the Reagan administration. The national debt increased by almost 3 times during his administration. So when I think it was 186% over, which is almost a tripling of the debt over his 8 years. So and those cuts you either continue to run up the debt or you make cuts. And we've made significant cuts in spending over the last 6 or 7 years here anyway.
And this debt in the budget, 1 trillion again?
1.5 trillion.
1.5 by the Republican estimate. Does that even take into account the unfunded liabilities in our Social Security program or other programs?
I don't believe so, no. I think this was just an analysis of the tax cuts that were proposed,
So this-
that were anticipated under this budget.
So this compounds the tax increases that our children and grandchildren will have to face.
That's correct.
Yeah, so I mean, this is an enormous tax increase on our kids and grandkids. And I just wanted to make that clear, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I too want to join in thanking the Budget Committee, Chairman and the Ranking Member for all of your work on these issues. And I'm just struck, we return again and again as we deal with these big issues to fundamental philosophical difference. And those of us on this side, believe firmly that the American people ought to be the ones making these decisions. And the question whether we're dealing with health care, whether we think that the federal government ought to be deciding what kind of insurance you must be forced to buy and which doctors you can see and not see, or whether we're talking about taxes, whether we're talking about whether the American people get to keep more of the money that they make. And these are huge issues. These are the issues we were elected to deal with. And the American people spoke very clearly, not just in my home state of Wyoming, but across the country last November, in saying that they want to see their taxes cut. They want to see the tax system reformed. They want to get the kind of economic growth that we know we can only get if we do, in fact, let people keep more of their own money. And there are many of us up here who talk about how important it is to cut spending, but Chairwoman Black, I want to particularly commend you for the hard work that you did in the House budget to actually find those spending cuts. And those are the kinds of things we've all got to return to again if we are, in fact, going to leave our kids not bearing a tremendous burden, and if we're going to be able to fund our Defense Department at the level that we need to. So I look forward very much to supporting this budget. I look forward to moving forward on tax cuts and tax reform. And I'm confident that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will, in fact, read the bill, even though Mr. McGovern has already said he's going to oppose the bill before we've even seen it. But I'm confident that we will read the bill and that we will, in fact, be successful at getting tax cuts done for the American people. I yield back.
Joel yields back her time. Thank you very much. Is there any other member of the committee that would wish to engage this first panel? Seeing none, I want to thank both of you for your time and your interest and your effort and your delivery ability and your confidence in our desire to move forth tomorrow as we approach this issue. Thank you very much. If you please make sure whatever you brought in writing will be left for all stenographers. Yeah, gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, I want to ask unanimous consent. Since Mr. Byrne referenced the Republican Better Way agenda, I thought we should insert it in the record and just point out that the plan calls for a dramatic reform without increasing the deficit, which what we're talking about today seems to violate. So I like that.
Without objection, we'll name that in the record, and thank you very much. The committee now will prepare for its second panel that will include the gentlewoman, Mrs. Jayapal, the gentlewoman, Barbara Lee, the gentleman, Coach Bill Pascrell, the gentlewoman, Mrs. Schakowsky, and the gentleman, Mr. Grothman from Wisconsin. Bill, I like your purse.
Thank you.
It's a good one. That was most gracious. I'm glad. Mr. Grothman, we'll let the clerk, Ms. Booth, get you there. Thank you.
Yes, now it is.
Okay, it seems as though we've got three people on this panel. Please be advised for any members that are watching, if anyone would choose to come and give testimony about the sentiment to H. Conrest 74. This is the second and would appear to be the last panel, notwithstanding that we did mention some members' names that had indicated the desire to be here, not knowing whether this is a good time for them or not. Lady and gentlemen, welcome to the committee. We're delighted that you're here to give not only your feedback, but your ideas about this. Without objection, anything you brought in writing will be available for Awesome Stenographer to complete the work, and we want to thank the Awesome Stenographer for her help and assistance. Ms. J. Paul, without objection, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member Slaughter, and distinguished members of this panel. I have not testified before you before, so I appreciate the honor and the privilege of speaking in support of my amendment to the Senate amendment to the fiscal year 2018 budget resolution. And I'm honored to have the Ranking Member of the Budget Committee, John Yarmuth, and the Ranking Member of this panel, Congresswoman Slaughter, join me in this effort. Mr. Chairman, you may know that when we considered this resolution in July in the Budget Committee, my colleagues and I offered 28 different amendments. The amendments that we offered were meant to help set a course away from a path that we believe would be highly detrimental to the American public and to working families. And we offered amendments on a broad range of issues that were important to our communities and families, and everything from protecting our communities from the effects of climate change, preserving health care, investing in public health, research and diplomacy, and investing in our nation's workforce and infrastructure. Perhaps not surprisingly, in this environment, not a single one made it through. Sadly, Mr. Chairman, this budget resolution, we feel, is based on the same faulty assumptions as the bill that came through committee, and they include assuming that the repeal of the Affordable Care Act happened and that an unrealistic economic growth of 3% would prevail. Now, we've just had a long discussion that I sat through on exactly where the tax cuts are going, and that is really what my amendment gets to, declaring that the tax cuts proffered by this budget resolution will not apply to households in the top 1% of income is my amendment. It takes a small but I think significant step forward in demonstrating that working families do matter to Congress and that ultimately the benefits of any tax package that we offer should go to those who need it the most. And I do believe that there should be bipartisan support for an amendment that says if you're in the top 1% of the population of this country, those income earners, that you would not see a tax cut out of this bill. Mr. Chairman, I believe that putting the interests of corporations and the wealthiest ahead of working families does not get us to a sustainable economy. And there were many examples offered. One was around President Kennedy. That rate went from 91%, that was the top marginal rate at the time, down to 65%. That was the cut that he proposed. Today's top marginal rate is 35%. But I wanted to give you another example, which is earlier this summer, the Republican-dominated Kansas legislature was forced to roll back its own 2012 cuts. In fact, a recent Brookings Institution analysis found that the tax cuts resulted in, and I'm quoting here, an anemic level of revenues which led to ballooning shortfalls, causing significant cutbacks in vital programs such as Medicaid, education, temporary assistance for needy families, court funding, and infrastructure. And if you look at what happened in Kansas, Kansas cut income taxes, and it was the same proposition that if you cut these taxes for the wealthiest and for corporations, you would somehow end up with a burgeoning economy. But here's what happened. The top rate in Kansas went from 6.4% to 4.9%. Kansas eliminated taxes almost entirely on pass-through income, and that was supposed to attract new businesses. It was supposed to boost school and local government funding. And then the idea was that eventually you would actually bring income tax rates all the way down to zero, essentially eliminate them. But what happened? What happened was battles over less and less revenue in Kansas. There was about a $700 million drop-off. Job growth lagged behind the national average, behind the neighboring states, and rating agencies downgraded Kansas. And so it became extremely difficult, and this now what we've seen is a rollback of those tax cuts. So this budget resolution, I believe, will lead us into the same hole, and yet we know that this only gives the majority license to call for further cuts to critical programs. So I just wanted to highlight again the statistics that Mr. Hastings offered during his comments in the last debate. 80% of the tax cut would go to the top. This is based on what we know. I understand we don't have everything in front of us. But 80% of the tax cut would go to the top 1% by 2027. The average tax cut for the top 1% in 2027 would be $207,000, and for millionaires, the tax cut would provide $230,000 a year. For the top 0.1%, that would be $1 million a year, and 42 million middle-class households would face a tax increase. I represent a district that is actually incredibly fortunate economically. We have a lot of millionaires and billionaires. We have a lot of people who have done very well for themselves. And when I was in the state Senate, we actually had put forward a bill that had the support of people like Bill Gates Sr., some of the wealthiest people in the country who said, we would like to pay our fair share. We would like to make sure we invest back into the communities where we're living. And I believe that there are many people in the top 1% who would agree with this amendment and would say, yes, please, House of Representatives, please do your job. Make sure that the tax cuts do not go to the top 1%. Make sure that they go to middle-class families and working families across the country. So, Mr. Chairman, I believe we have an opportunity here to do the right thing, and I would urge the committee to adopt the Jayapal Yarmouth Slaughter Amendment as a start, and let's work on a moral budget blueprint that supports all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I
Yes,
yield
ma'am.
back.
Thank you very much. Coach?
Always a pleasure.
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Sessions and the rest of the committee on both sides, Ranking Member Slaughter. I'm here today to speak in support of my amendment co-sponsored by Ranking Member of the Budget Committee, John Yarmouth, and Ranking Member of the Rules Committee, Louise Slaughter. My amendment would state that the policy of Congress is that the state and the local tax deduction shall be retained. Taxpayers at every level and in every district benefit from the state and local tax, the SALT deduction, whether directly or indirectly. In 2015, the deduction benefited more than 44 million taxpayers, representing more than 100 million Americans. Nearly 40% of taxpayers with incomes between $50,000 and $75,000 claim SALT. More than 70% of those making between $100,000 and $200,000 claim it also. In higher cost states like mine, and New Jersey, and many others, SALT benefits working and middle class families. This amendment carries more urgency at this budget resolution, Mr. Chairman. The resolution includes the Capito Amendment, a formal policy statement that directs the budget committees to reduce federal deductions for state and local taxes. If the House is not permitted to vote to protect the SALT deduction, then members who vote for the budget will be expressing their support for a tax increase on hardworking middle-class families to pay for corporate tax cuts. Groups ranging from the National Association of Realtors, the Conference of Mayors, the National Sheriff's Association, et cetera, support this, retaining the SALT. They know that double taxing state and local taxes. Talk about double taxing? Where have we heard that before in terms of another piece of this budget? They know that double taxing state and local taxes paid leads to cuts to state and local services, a result that would hurt everyone. The harmful Capito Amendment says the SALT deduction only benefits high-income taxpayers. And Secretary Mnuchin has said we should get out of subsidizing states. I'll come back to this in a moment. He is dead wrong. But who is subsidizing whom? The gentlelady from Wyoming asked very significant questions before. Who's subsidizing whom? I have you know that New Jersey pays more than $3,717 per person to the federal government over what it gets back. And where does that money go, Mr. Chairman? Just exactly where does that money go? Well, like numbers, take a look at the numbers. Sometimes the numbers lie, but take a look at all the numbers comprehensively. Mississippi gets back $6,495 per person per year from the federal government. West Virginia gets back $6,765 per person from the federal government. and Alabama gets back $6,193 per person per year. Who is subsidizing whom? So maybe it is us who are subsidizing those low state tax states who could keep their own taxes artificially low because of federal subsidies. More than 4 in 10 in New Jersey taxpayers deduct their state and local income taxes from their returns each year. In New Jersey's 9th district, my district, 37% of taxpayers claimed a deduction, with the average amount claimed to be $18,668 per household. I want you to join me, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of this committee in supporting preserving this important deduction for families and communities across our country. I urge you to support this amendment. It affects a lot of people in the United States of America. And I yield back.
Mr. Presco, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Ms. Grothman, we're delighted that you're here. Mr. Presco is going to share that microphone with you. The gentleman asked me if it'd be okay for him to come today, and I'm delighted that you took me up on it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that you had to sit through.
It was entertaining, man.
Well-
I learned stuff. I'm going to quote Mr. Yarmouth next week in closed conference.
Well, we're just delighted that you're here, Ms. Grothman. I found you one of the newer members who is interested in not only coming up here and paying attention, but the theater that comes with it. Gentleman's now authorized.
Well, thank you. I
Recommend.
want to be brief. I appreciate you guys listening to me. Want to point out a little bit of the history of this budget worked through the Budget Committee. It was very frustrating voting for the budget out of the Budget Committee because by the time we were done, we were spending $81 billion more a year than what we did last year and what President Trump suggested. The only reason that bill got out of committee, some of us who were worried about just the exploding debt, $20 trillion and such, was at the time we had a tiny $200 billion cut in mandatory spending over 10 years. And I think less than half the Republicans on that committee would have voted out of the committee without that on there. Then we get to the Senate, and while the Senate acted on its own, I'm sure they acted with a little bit of input from the House. They not only took away the $202 billion cut, but they added about another, I think it is, $18 billion more in discretionary spending. And between when we took that thing out of the Budget Committee, we since then have had 3 hurricanes and are spending about $50 billion there. So one would think the hurricanes and the additional discretionary spending would cause some people to say, we really ought to especially look at mandatory spending. And I don't even like the increase in discretionary spending. I introduced something before this committee because I thought we were going up too high on defense. But instead, they took out the one little victory the responsible part of the Republican Party had on the Budget Committee. And I didn't like it, so I figured I'd show up here today and reintroduce it just so I could say I tried. Thank you for putting up with me.
Yes, sir. We're delighted that you're here. Could you tell me what the current GDP is? I had to look it up as you were speaking. The economy grew at a rate of about 3% in the first quarter and about 4% in the second quarter. You had talked about or characterized the GDP growth in a way. Is that good or is that bad?
Well, I think the question, and we had a number of economists from both sides of the aisle come and testify to us on Budget Committee, and the question of whether you can actually keep a 3% sustainable GDP growth over the course of time, I think there's only a couple of ways to do it. I mean, if you really wanted to do it, one of the economists, Republican economists said, Doug Holsekin said, pass immigration reform. That would increase the labor supply. That would put more money back into the economy. But unless you do that, there's not a lot of ways to keep a 3% growth rate sustainable. So I don't think there's many economists that believe that that's a reasonable assumption to make in this budget.
Interesting. Well, I have a different economist. I guess like getting a different lawyer. I think 3% is the right. I really actually think 4% growth is the correct way to do things. And I think we can do that and will, and that's what this bill is designed to do. I just felt like there were some advice you had for us, like maybe 3% was not so great.
I do have advice. It's, let's find a different way to invest in our economy. I don't believe that the tax cuts and the trickle-down economic theory that we have practiced before, that we've seen in Kansas, is going to lead us to the result that I think many of us might want for our states and for our
Why
populations.
would you assume Kansas when we could look at California or New York or Illinois
Well,
or
Kansas,
other states?
excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Kansas is the most recent example, I think, of putting into practice what this bill and what this philosophy would try to get us to. It's the most recent example of that, and it's a place that, again, is not a democratically controlled state. This is a Republican-controlled state. Republican legislature had to move back those tax cuts in Kansas and had to deal with the effects over the last several years of, assumptions that were faulty. There were a lot of interesting assumptions there that by cutting taxes and giving most of it to the wealthiest and to the biggest corporations, that you would generate growth, right? That's the basis of this assumption. And I think Ms. Cheney is right when she says there are different approaches, different philosophies around this. But I would say that ultimately, we believe that if you invest in regular working families, they will be able to stimulate the economy versus putting all of the money into the top 1%, the wealthiest corporations, and asking them to turn around and reinvest that. As Mr. Yarmouth said, that only happens in very specific circumstances. That's not the circumstance we have right now.
Well, but we're not putting all the money. So
Well, I
that's the
don't-
fallacy to your argument. We're not putting all the money. We're putting the money and going to spread that money out. Once again, I know there's a variance this afternoon about how much people are going to pay, but the average family would receive a $4,000 tax rebate.
Mr. Chairman, I
And
am...
that's not your facts. I get that. That's directly out of Diane Black.
Well, I'd love to see an actual score on this. I hope that we have 2 weeks to look at whatever bill comes forward. I hope that we have a chance to really assess and analyze so that we can have, an objective score that we could look at, and let's see. I mean, if that is the case, then perhaps Mr. McGovern and I and others will look at the bill differently. But what we have in front of us, and I'm on the Budget Committee. I sat through all the discussions on the Budget Committee. I'm the vice-ranking member there. What I have seen and what has been articulated is this, and I'll just read it again. 80% of the tax cut goes to the top 1%.
That's correct.
Average tax cut for the top 1% is $207,000 a year. Average tax cut for those making at least $1 million is $230,000 a year. And the average tax cut for the top 1/10 of 1% is $1 million a year. Mr. Chairman, I don't actually believe that the American people think that that is a good deal for them, and we'll find out, certainly. But
We'll find out, but that was not the point. The point was how much are the average American families going to get? That was the statement. You referenced what was going to be given back to top 1%. I'm talking about the average American family.
let's just assume, Mr. Chairman, that your assumption
No,
of
it's not my
6,000.
assumption. It came from Diane Black.
Let's assume that I believe there are some assumptions to how that $6,000 gets calculated that goes back, but let's assume that that's, or four, let's assume that that's true. Are you saying that you think it's appropriate that the average American would get a $4,000 tax cut and somebody earning the top 1/10 of 1% would get $1 million? That's your belief is that if we're going to invest a bunch of money into some place, we should invest it into millionaires and not into working people, because you have much more faith in the millionaires than you do in the working people.
Well,
That's what I would take from that.
Well, I'll just tell you point blank, I believe in the free enterprise system. I watched after we raised taxes, there was zero GDP growth for the next year, and we suffered mightily. And that was a prescription that a person liked, and it went across that way. We're trying to grow GDP, and I think that you'll see that's what happens. We're going to grow GDP, and we're going to see what happens and see if the average person likes it or not. I'm simply taking the testimony. I'm not trying to make this up myself. I'm
Well-
taking testimony. I was asking you about your testimony, and I would simply say back, I think a 4% growth is, or 3% in this case, you think is non-sustainable. I think it's what we're aiming for.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I'll just
Yes,
tell you, three economists came and testified to us, and I don't think a single one said that they thought it was, and these are witnesses from the majority and the minority together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to aim for that 4% growth. Yes, sir. Coach?
Mr. Chairman, let me use this as an example in response to your very, very specific question. 9 men on the team, baseball team, and 3 of them are batting .400. You know what the rest of them are batting? And I say, my team is the average on my team is batting what? Well, we got most of the players are batting only .200. 3 of the players are batting .400. So averages are something you need to take a look at. The median is something you need to take a look at. And I'm very concerned that this budget that we're passing, we will raise some boats and some boats will sink. People are depending upon the ability to write off, to deduct their local and state taxes. If the average person, the average household is getting back $18,000, that's nothing we can sneeze about, and I'm sure you would say the same thing too. And the reason why we're looking at that particular deduction, Mr. Chairman, and the reason why we were looking at trying to minimize a bit the 401k program, and the reason why we originally were talking about getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction was to find revenue to do these things. And I'm glad that at least you're trying to find revenue at the beginning of the process. When you don't have that revenue, when you're ready to start the final part of the process, is going to be very interesting. So you might back yourself, you and I, into a corner, because this is not going to work as is laid out when we don't even have the program to begin with in front of us in black and white. That's not your fault. So I would look very carefully at this. And the deduction for the SALT deduction, the state and local taxes, we need to take a look at because it covers a lot of people. It covers a lot of people. And if it was affecting the smaller states, I'd be just as concerned too. My record is that I'm fair to everybody, try to be fair to everybody. Not Santa Claus, I said fair to everybody. Sometimes I get the feeling, in terms of questions, not necessarily yours right now, is that Democrats want to be Santa Claus. We got to pay taxes just like everybody else. But we want it to be a fair system. That's what we're asking for. And so I ask you to consider, as one aspect of this, the state and local tax issue, because I think it's very, very comprehensive, and I ask you to really consider it. Thank you.
So let me say back to you, since you and I are friends, it's not addressed in here, is it?
I'm sorry?
It's not addressed in here, is it? It will be addressed with the tax bill when it comes out.
All right. But in order to get to that, we have to pass a budget.
Well, that's true. All I'm simply suggesting, it's not discussed in this document that I can find.
But Mr.
You're
Chairman,
not trying to, what are you trying to amend?
I'm not debating what you're saying. I'm simply saying that this is the preface to the whatever the reform bill shows, whatever it says. And going back the last time we did this, many years ago, in the mid-'80s, in fact, it was a very comprehensive bipartisan plan. People worked together, not at the end, but at the very beginning, There was over 200 hearings on this.
But there's no tax rates in here. It's all just money.
Yeah,
It's not addressed.
correct.
That's all I'm
Yeah,
saying.
but you're laying the foundation,
I'd
Mr. Chairman.
like to invite you back, Bill.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Oh, it's
Chairman
not-
Cole?
Just quickly, because we see one another frequently at Budget Committee meetings, and just three terrific members, glad they're all here. I just want to quickly respond to something my friend from Wisconsin said, because I think he makes a really important point. This budget is important. It's largely important because it's a vehicle. You know, we all know it's a resolution without force of law. Congress can do whatever it wants to. So, but there are a couple of places where it really does matter. It really does matter when we finally get a negotiation, what the so-called 302A is, because that'll set the top line for discretionary. There's a number here, but it really doesn't matter because we have the Budget Control Act in place, so there'll be a negotiation. But my friend is exactly right about the unwillingness of anybody or enough people on both sides of the aisle to get serious about entitlement reform and or mandatory spending, whichever phrase that you predict. We're sitting here talking as if the taxes are going to unbalance the budget, or as if what we do occasionally on the discretionary side is going to unbalance the budget, or if, you know, what we do for our fellow citizens in dire situations and disaster relief unbalances the budget. None of those things unbalance the budget anywhere close to what goes on in mandatory spending. And that's a debate that has to really happen. Now, I happen to think the tax cut here, and there's room for people of goodwill on both sides of this issue to disagree, will ultimately generate economic growth, and that's a good thing, provide opportunity, generate long-term additional revenue. My friend Mr. Burns gave us several examples where that indeed has proven to be the case. And it's even more significant when they're permanent, or at least elements are permanent, so people can literally make investments long-term and know. So I think I look on that as a positive contribution, and that frankly is the main reason why I'm willing to vote for this budget. I don't like the budget itself very much. I think our friends in the Senate, we keep sending really good people over there, but they all turn into senators. You know, I don't know how much more of this we can stand. Because we had a lot of people over there that have arrived in the last 2 or 3 cycles that used to vote for budgets like the kind that Mr. Grothman's talking about, that literally had much more significant entitlement reform. And he's exactly right when he says $200 billion over 10 years out of what will be over $30 trillion worth of mandatory spending is nothing. It's a rounding error. So the fact that our friends in the Senate couldn't muster up the courage to do that is concerning to me. So I just want to encourage my friend from Wisconsin to continue to raise the issue. He's raising the right issue. I think we will be, the Speaker made a commitment, as my friend knows, in conference, largely due to my friend's comments, that we're going to be addressing that next year, that we get this thing done. That becomes item number one, is to start looking at the mandatory area. So I actually made this same point recently to the President of the United States. Didn't much like this budget. You know, I thought it stinks. You know, really do. It's not nearly as good as the one that Ms. Black produced, and I know my friends disagree with that, but it's a serious budget. It balanced within 10 years. It had some mandatory savings in it, and I think it was a good faith effort to try and move us in the right direction. But these opportunities for tax reform don't come very often. And the last serious one around here was a long, long time ago in 1986, predates anybody that's on up here now, I think, in terms of their time in Congress, perhaps, but certainly mine. So I'm going to take this opportunity while it's coming, because I think that's the best our friends on the other side of the rotunda can do. But they're going to have to do a lot better. And the administration's going to have to join in that too. You can't do serious, mandatory spending reform without administration leadership. And I'll also say that my friends on the other side of the aisle will need to participate in that too. When you do mandatory spending reform, there's only one way to do it, and it's bipartisan. Now, there's a lot of talk about third rails and the inability to do this stuff. The reality is, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill didn't exactly see the world the same way, but they managed to get it done. And the year after they got it done and extended the life of Social Security, Ronald Reagan won 49 states in re-election. Tip O'Neill stayed as Speaker of the House. So when you work together for the right things, you really can do it. And I will tell some of my friends on my side, if you really want to fix it, you're going to have to put additional revenue in it. I'm going to tell some of my friends on the other side, when we're all living a lot longer, it's not going to stay forever. It was 65 for my dad. It's 66 for me. It's 67 for my 35-year-old. All of us have been given plenty of time to adapt to that, 401ks, IRAs. I applaud the president for defending those. But we're going to have to get, and I would commend my friends. I'm taking a little longer, but I'll quit with this because I don't really have a lot of questions here. My friend Mr. Delaney and I actually went back and looked pretty thoroughly at what President Reagan and Tip O'Neill and really Howard Baker did. And they set up a commission. It was called the Greenspan Commission. And they basically took about a year. We all know what the fixes here are, particularly on Social Security. It's a math problem. We know how long people live. We know how many of them there are. We know about how much money comes in every year. You just got to, if you don't want to throw out the program, and I do not, I want to save the program, restore it to fiscal soundness, it's literally a pretty quick negotiation, and you sit down and everybody puts a little something on the table, and you can fix this thing. Medicare and Medicaid are much harder because we've really done something in the last generation. It's pretty remarkable. We used to increase lifespan just simply by cutting infant mortality. We didn't really add to the end of life. Most people died by around 70. And that's changed now. You get to 65 today, you got a 50% chance to get into 85. You've got a 25% chance of getting to 93. Now that I'm 68, by the way, just for the record, I think these are very good things. But it's expensive. It's an expensive time of life, usually, because of the health challenges that are associated with it, or the ravages of disease like Alzheimer's, where we step up as a country and look after people who are in those awful circumstances. So those are going to be tougher, but I think they're doable too. But we should start with Social Security where we can. And I'll just end with this. While we're arguing taxes and we're arguing this, that my friend here from Wisconsin has put his finger on the real problem, which is entitlement spending and the unwillingness to do anything about it, even reasonable things. It's not unreasonable to raise the cap, so that more people pay. It's not unreasonable in a day of lengthening lifespan to tell people that are 30 or 40 years. I'm not talking about people that are close to retiring. They didn't do that, when Reagan and Tip, but they gave you plenty of time and mechanisms to adjust. And those kind of common sense things can save what's been the most important single program for lifting people out of poverty and keeping them out of poverty in their senior years. So I want my friend to keep sounding the warnings, and hopefully next year we'll have more people that listen to them, because this will be in the rearview mirror one way or the other, and maybe we can get serious about actually going after some of these concerns and correcting them. So with that, I know it went on a long time, but I feel very strongly about what my friend's doing. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chairman, thank you very much. And I feel the same about Mr. Grothman being here, and I appreciate him very much. As I stated, I encouraged him to come and sit here for a couple hours for you to have a chance. Mr. Prescrow? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Under the plan that's before us now, in addition, I want you to know, whether you probably know already, businesses would get to keep the SALT deduction. This burns me. Even as families would lose it. That's the plan that's before you. Businesses would continue to be able to write off state and local taxes as a business expense, while families would pay more. It's unfair and it's unjustifiable. And yes, the Capito Amendment is in this plan. It says no SALT. Section 3024. Take a look at it. Your plan. I bring that to your attention. I think that this is critical. You should know this. But if business gets the break and the families don't, you know what, Chairman, let me tell you something politically. You're giving Democrats ammunition that we don't have to have. We got other ammunition. It's just unfair, period. Tell me it is not. Tell me it is fair. It's fair that the businesses get the break and the families don't. Thank you.
Mrs. Slaughter?
Mr. Chairman, I approve all the amendments being made in order. Mr. Worthman certainly deserves that, as well as my friends here, because obviously the depth of what we know, we do not know yet this week. But it's troubling to me that we're going to try to trickle down one more time. I think Kansas and what we did here in the Congress already shows that doesn't work. I appreciate your amendments. I support the two of those. And I would support Mr. Worthman's probably if I had more time to look at it. But this is really an issue, I think, a day when we should move ourselves to allow all amendments. And yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Tom, gentleman of Massachusetts.
Wait a minute. If I must say that SALT is serious, and everybody in my district is counting on us not doing that insane thing. So thank you, Mr. Pasquarello, for bringing that up. It's devastating to all of us, and I hope we have enough people in the Northeast and part of the Eastern Seaboard that we can go a long way towards trying to defeat that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for being here. I support all your amendments. And Mr. Grothman, it's always nice to see you up here pushing for an open debate, even though I rarely agree with you. And I have to be honest with you, though, I'm a bit disappointed that when you say that you're fighting for your ideas, then you literally vote to block your ideas. The last time you were here, we did about the House budget, you had an amendment, and I said if I were a betting person, I would bet that the people up here would not make your amendment in order. And I asked if your amendment was not made in order, would you vote against the rule? And you said no. Turns out I was right. They didn't make it in order. They did block your amendment. And we looked it up. Roll call vote 552. Hard to believe, but you voted for the rule to block your own amendment. So here we are again. My question is, when your friends up here block your amendment again today, are you going to again vote with them to block your amendment?
Of course, the rule includes more than just my amendment.
Well, I mean,
It's part of a larger thing.
Well, let me ask Mr. Pasquarello, will you vote against the rule if they don't make your amendment in order? Yeah. Will you vote against the rule? I'm just simply saying, that, I mean, I love all these people who have these passionate principles when it comes to standing before a microphone or testifying in a committee. But when it comes to vote, nobody seems to have the courage to stand up to your own leadership that routinely block your amendment. I'll tell you what, Mr. Grothman, we will offer your amendment. The Democrats will vote to make it in order, even though we don't agree with it, because we believe that this place needs to return to regular order and it needs to be a deliberative body again.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. We'll do what your own party won't do for you and other conservatives. I yield back.
Judge Hastings.
Just ask unanimous consent to include in the record, I support all three of the amendments being made in order, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to include as unanimous consent that the statement of Congresswoman Lee and Congresswoman Schakowsky, their statements be made a part of it.
Without objection, we'll include this work. Thank you very much. Ms. Polis?
And their,
I'm sorry, Judge.
their amendments as well.
No further comments.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. See, any other member that would wish time with the panel? Thank you very much. If you'll please remember, we have an awesome stenographer who would like to finish out her record and could take anything you provided in writing to enable her to do that. And thank you very much. We ready to go? Okay. Is there any other member that would seek time for the committee? Seeing none, this now close to the hearing portion of Senate Amendment to H. Conres 74, 71.
Mr. Chairman, the reporter
Excuse me
can't
just a
hear
moment,
you.
please. Gentleman, Florida.
I just was saying the
Yes, sir.
reporter can't hear.
Yes, sir.
They were unnecessarily mean to you last time. I didn't get a
Not only that, I decided I wouldn't.
Chair will now be in receipt of a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant a rule providing for consideration of the Senate amendment to H-Con Res. 71, establishing the congressional budget for the United States of America for fiscal year 2018 and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2019 through 2027. The rule makes an order of motion offered by the chair of the committee on the budget or her designee that the House concur in the Senate amendment to H-Con Res. 71. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the motion. The rule provides that the Senate amendment and the motion shall be considered as read. And finally, the rule provides 1 hour of debate on the motion, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget.
You've now heard the motion from the gentleman from Georgia. Is there amendment or discussion to that?
There is, Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for all the amendments submitted to the Rules Committee to the Senate amendment to H-Con Res. 71, both Republican and Democrat, and we'd ask for a yes vote.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. We've just finished a very lively opportunity whereby our members had a chance to come and discuss these amendments, so I assume we all are aware of them. Is there further discussion? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the slaughter amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
No, the noes have it. Noes have it.
Roll call,
The
please.
gentlewoman asked roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall.
No.
Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck, Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter.
Yes.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to for amendment or discussion. Gentleman from
Mr. Chairman,
Massachusetts. Yes, sir.
I'm a man of my word. I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment to the Senate amendment to H-Con Res. 71 by Representative Grothman, number 8. It's a bad amendment, but I think that he deserves a right to have his day on the floor, and I wish this place would become more reflective of what a deliberative body should be. So I urge a yes vote.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
We would not have made this amendment in order as a part of the regular budget process. It's been a long-standing tradition that we accept substitutes, but we don't accept line item amendments, and it seems to be a disservice to all of our other members who would have brought line item amendments had they thought those would be made in order. I support making substitutes in order, but I would oppose making a line item. So I support the idea.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
But the concept.
Yeah, and I love the way we all kind of talk around being able to vote affirmatively on this, but there was no conference, and so this is the only opportunity that Mr. Grothman has to offer this kind of proposal.
We don't argue that point. We recognize that.
So,
To my friend's point, it's not that we're talking around it, it's that if it were a conference report, we would also not be making amendments in order. It's that we're misleading folks into thinking that we would make these
well,
amendments
you know
in order,
what?
when in fact we would not.
I mean, regular order is dead, so we might as well try to resuscitate it.
Well, a conference report is non-amendable.
Well, there was no conference report.
I agree
mean,
with
there's
that. All
no.
I'm saying,
yeah,
we were
it's not- we're not-
suggesting like, well, if it were, it'd be different, but it's not. So,
We don't do conference reports, so I ask for a yes vote.
good point. Further discussion? Vote will now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it.
As
Noes
for
have
roll
it.
call.
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to. Gentleman.
I have another amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make in order and give the necessary waivers for an amendment to the Senate amendment to H-Con Res. 71 by Representatives Pascrell, Slaughter, Yarmouth, and myself. Number 3, which would restore funding for programs that ensure families can provide basic standard of living for themselves and their families. And as we mentioned during the testimony, this budget cuts a lot of social safety programs like SNAP, which allows people to put food on their table.
Discussion? Vote now be on the Montgomery Amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Those have it, those have it.
Ask for roll call.
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will hold the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern? Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman? No. Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will vote.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Amendment's not agreed to, none agreed to the affirmative amendment or discussion, seeing none, vote now be on the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it.
Roll call.
Gentlewoman asked for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Report the total.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman, distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, be hand on this for Republicans. Got your wish.
Mr. McGovern for the
Mr.
minority.
McGovern for Democrats, thank you very much. So that the question will come up, and I will give an answer around. We do not expect any other meetings this week. The Rules Committee is through with its work for the day.
You think we'll follow this?